Hello, friends, and welcome back to Retire and Roam. Have you ever wondered how an entire town can simply disappear? Not in some ancient legend, but in modern times. Streets, homes, schools, shops, even swimming pools, built for real families, lived in for real lives, and then suddenly left behind. If you're someone who enjoys smart travel, loves hidden history, thinks about retirement with curiosity, or simply wants to understand how places rise and fall, today's journey is for you. Because this is more than a story about abandoned towns. It is about money, opportunity, risk, community, and what happens when the ground beneath a place, or a life, turns out to be less permanent than it seemed. Today, we're exploring 10 ghost towns in Canada that shouldn't exist. Some were erased by collapsing industries. Some were defeated by nature. Some were abandoned by policy and progress. But all of them still have something powerful to teach us. So grab your coffee, settle in, and travel with me through places that were once full of hope, ambition, and everyday life. And before we begin, please subscribe to Retire and Roam for more stories that help you explore wisely, live fully, and see the world a little differently. 1. Kitsault, British Columbia. The billion-dollar time capsule. Our first stop takes us deep into the remote wilderness of northern British Columbia, not far from the Alaskan border, to a place that feels almost impossible when you first see it. Picture a fully built modern town with neat suburban homes, apartment blocks, a shopping center, a hospital, a theater, even a swimming pool, all sitting in silence with no real community left inside it. That is Kitsault, one of the strangest ghost towns in Canada, and in many ways one of the most revealing. Kitsault was built in 1979 by the Phelps Dodge Corporation to serve a nearby molybdenum mine. The company poured about $250 million into creating this town from scratch, which would be well over $800 million in today's terms. Families arrived believing they were stepping into a secure future. On the surface, it looked like the ideal company town, clean, organized, prosperous, and full of promise. But the deeper reality was much more fragile. The entire town depended on one commodity, one employer, and one economic assumption: that demand would hold. It did not. Just 18 months after residents began settling in, molybdenum prices collapsed. The mine was suspended, and by the end of 1983, the people living there were told to leave. Just like that, a town designed to represent long-term stability was emptied almost overnight. Homes were abandoned, routines were broken, and an entire community disappeared faster than most people could emotionally process. What makes Kitsault so haunting is that it was not left to decay in the usual way. In 2005, the town was purchased by a billionaire for a fraction of its original cost. Since then, caretakers have continued maintaining the properties, mowing lawns, repairing roofs, and keeping the place looking strangely alive. It remains frozen in time, like a perfectly preserved reminder that wealth and permanence are not the same thing. And that is really the lesson here. In retirement, in real estate, and in life, many people are drawn to places that look stable simply because they look polished or profitable. But true security is not built on appearances. Kitsault reminds us that when a town, an investment, or even a lifestyle depends too heavily on one source of support, it may be far more vulnerable than it seems. Real stability comes from flexibility, diversification, and the ability to adapt when conditions change. And from that billion-dollar time capsule in British Columbia, we move to another place where the dream was real, the infrastructure was impressive, and yet the foundation underneath was already beginning to fail. 2. Bankhead, Alberta, the town that was erased. Millions of travelers pass through Banff National Park every year, taking in the mountains, the lakes, and the postcard beauty of the Canadian Rockies. But very few realize they are also passing by one of the most fascinating ghost towns in the country. Tucked below Cascade Mountain sits Bankhead, a place that was once not just active, but ahead of its time. Founded in 1903 by the Canadian Pacific Railway, Bankhead was built as a coal mining town, and for a while, it thrived. At its peak, nearly 1,000 people lived there. In fact, Bankhead was more modern than Banff itself in some ways, with electricity, a municipal water system, and streetlights at a time when much of the surrounding area was still developing. On paper, it looked like a smart industrial success story: strong employer, useful resource, growing population. But the coal was the problem. It was poor quality, brittle, and unreliable. Nearly half of it broke down into useless dust before it could even be sold properly. Miners pushed deeper and deeper, digging more than 185 miles of tunnels in search of better material. But the harder they worked, the clearer the truth became. The resource base was weak. Labor disputes grew, frustration rose, and eventually the operation could no longer justify itself. In 1922, the mine shut down. What happened next is what makes Bankhead especially unforgettable. This was not a town that simply faded away. Because the company owned so much of it, the town was physically dismantled. Buildings were hauled away to Banff, Canmore, and Calgary. Then, with the National Parks Act of 1930, any return of the settlement was effectively blocked. Bankhead was not only abandoned, it was erased. There is also a deeper and darker human story here. Chinese laborers in the town were segregated, underpaid, and forced into the hardest and least valued work. Local legend speaks of a Chinese laundryman named Sam Singh, who was wrongly accused, deported, and said to have cursed the town before it closed. Whether that tale is folklore or not, it reflects something very real. Places are never built on economics alone. They are also built on how people are treated, who gets excluded, and what injustices are buried beneath progress. For anyone thinking seriously about where and how to build the next chapter of life, Bankhead offers a powerful warning. Effort alone cannot save a weak foundation. You can dig deeper, spend more, and work harder. But if the core asset is flawed, the outcome may still collapse. Sometimes the wisest move is not to keep pushing. It is to recognize when a place, a deal, or a plan no longer makes sense, and walk away before it takes more from you than it gives. 3. Saint-Jean-Vianney, Quebec, the swallowed village. If the first two towns on our list show us how communities can be undone by economics, Saint-Jean-Vianney reminds us that sometimes the danger is far more sudden and far more terrifying. This was not a town that slowly declined or quietly emptied out. This was a town that the earth itself took back. Saint-Jean-Vianney was once a lively village in Quebec, home to more than 1,200 people. It looked like the kind of place where life felt settled, familiar, and safe. But beneath that ordinary surface was a hidden threat. The village had been built on Leda clay, a highly unstable soil that can lose its strength and turn almost liquid when saturated and disturbed. The residents had no idea that the ground under their homes was holding a history it could not safely carry. In April of 1971, heavy rain began soaking the land. Then, on the night of May 4th, at about 10:15 p.m., everything changed. The ground opened, and within less than an hour, a massive landslide tore through the eastern part of town. Houses, cars, and even a bus were dragged into the collapsing earth by liquefied clay moving with shocking speed. Survivors later described the horror of stepping outside and watching homes disappear one after another, as if the land itself had decided they no longer belonged there. 31 people lost their lives that night. What remained was not a damaged town, but a wound in the landscape, a huge crater, a memorial, and a silence that still feels difficult to comprehend. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all is what researchers later discovered. The village had been built on top of the site of another landslide that had happened roughly 500 years earlier. The warning had always been there. No one knew how to read it. For anyone thinking about retirement, relocation, or where to place the next chapter of life, Saint-Jean-Vianney carries a lesson that reaches far beyond geography. We spend so much time thinking about the house, the price, the scenery, the lifestyle, but not always enough time asking what lies underneath. Whether we are talking about land, finances, health, or relationships, a beautiful structure means very little if the foundation has never truly been tested. And from this heartbreaking story of hidden instability, we move to a very different kind of risk, one driven not by the soil below, but by human ambition pushing far beyond what nature ever intended to allow. 4. Silver Islet, Ontario, the gamble beneath the waves. Now let's shift from tragedy to audacity, because Silver Islet may be one of the boldest mining stories in Canadian history. Sitting out in Lake Superior, this tiny rocky outcrop hardly looked like the site of a fortune. In fact, it was originally little more than a small rock, barely above the waterline, exposed to wind, waves, and the full force of one of North America's most unforgiving lakes. Then, in 1868, prospectors discovered a rich vein of silver there, and suddenly, the impossible seemed worth attempting. To reach it, the mining company expanded the island using crushed rock and built wooden breakwaters to shield it from the lake. They did not stop there. They began digging straight down, eventually creating a shaft about 384 meters deep beneath the waters of Lake Superior. It was an extraordinary engineering gamble, profitable, impressive, and always one mistake away from disaster. To keep the lake from pouring in, massive pumps had to run around the clock every day without fail. For 16 years, the mine produced remarkable wealth, yielding millions of dollars in silver. But the whole system depended on constant energy, constant supply, and constant control. Then, in 1883, a critical shipment of coal failed to arrive before the lake froze for winter. Without coal, the pumps stopped. And once they stopped, nature did what nature always does when given the chance. It reclaimed the space. In early 1884, the mine flooded for good. What makes Silver Islet so memorable is not just the silver, but the sheer effort required to hold back collapse. Even today, if you visit the area and look into the clear water, you can still glimpse the submerged remains of that ambitious world below the surface. It is a beautiful image, but also a revealing one, because in many ways, Silver Islet feels familiar to modern life. How many people build routines, budgets, careers, or lifestyles that only work as long as the pumps never stop? As long as the schedule holds, the income keeps coming, the stress stays manageable, and every moving part behaves exactly as planned. But life rarely stays that cooperative forever. Silver Islet reminds us that complexity has a cost, and sometimes the smartest move is not to build a bigger breakwater, but to simplify before the winter comes. 5. Val-Jalbert, Quebec, the frozen paradise. If Silver Islet was a story of daring ambition, Val-Jalbert is a story of something even more bittersweet. A place that truly felt like paradise, until progress quietly moved on without it. And that is what makes this next town so compelling. It was not born in hardship, it was born in promise. Val-Jalbert was founded in 1901 by entrepreneur Damasse Jalbert, right beside the spectacular Ouiachiouan Falls in Quebec. The setting alone feels almost unreal. The waterfall drops 72 meters, taller than Niagara Falls, and at its base rose one of the most advanced company towns of its time. Built around a pulp mill, Val-Jalbert offered workers something rare for that era: excellent wages, modern homes, electricity, and indoor plumbing long before much of rural Quebec had anything close to that standard. With a school, a convent, and a thriving general store, the town earned a reputation that former residents would later describe in one simple word: paradise. And yet paradise, in this case, depended on a single industry and a single technology. In 1927, global demand began shifting away from mechanical pulp toward chemical pulp. The mill at Val Jalbert could not make that transition, and once the economics changed, the dream unraveled quickly. The mill closed, families left, and by 1929, the village was deserted. One former resident later said that the day the mill shut down was the first time they had ever seen their parents cry. That detail tells you everything. This was not just the loss of jobs, it was the loss of a way of life people believed would last. But Val Jalbert does something rare among ghost towns. It offers not only a warning, but a kind of grace. Instead of disappearing into ruin, it was eventually preserved. Today, it stands as one of the best preserved ghost towns in Canada. Visitors can walk its quiet streets, stand in the shadow of that enormous waterfall, and even stay overnight in restored homes that still carry the feeling of another era. For those of us thinking about retirement, relocation, or the kinds of places we attach our future to, Val Jalbert offers a wise and gentle reminder. Even the most comfortable chapter of life can change when the world around it changes. Industries evolve, markets shift, technology moves on. But that does not mean what we built had no value. Some seasons of life are not meant to last forever. They are meant to be remembered, learned from, and carried forward in a different form. And from this beautifully preserved paradise, we move to a place with a very different response to decline. One that chose not nostalgia, but humor, stubbornness, and reinvention. 6. Rowley, Alberta, the town that laughed at death. If you want proof that personality can outlast prosperity, Rowley, Alberta may be the perfect example. Because while many towns fade quietly when their best years are behind them, Rowley did something far more memorable. It decided to have a sense of humor about it. Rowley began as a classic prairie town in the 1910s, built on farming and the railway. By the 1920s, it was a lively community of around 500 people, with grain elevators, a hospital, and a proper main street. Like so many settlements across the Canadian Plains and the American West, it was built on a practical formula. Agriculture, transportation, and community life all reinforcing one another. But then came the familiar chain reaction: economic hardship during the Great Depression, harsh droughts, and eventually the loss of railway service. Once that lifeline weakened, Rowley began to empty out. By the 1970s, the population had fallen to around a dozen people. At that point, most towns would have simply surrendered to time. But Rowley had a different spirit. One night, a few of the remaining locals broke into the old boarded-up saloon and threw a party. What started as one small act of rebellion turned into a surprisingly smart idea. Instead of pretending the town was still alive in the old way, they embraced what it had become. They repaired buildings, preserved the early 20th century look of the place, and even dressed mannequins in period clothing to give the streets a strange and playful sense of life. That creative stubbornness paid off. Rowley's preserved ghost town charm caught the attention of filmmakers, and before long it became a movie set for productions like Superman 3 and Bye Bye Blues. Tourists started showing up. Locals hosted pizza nights in the saloon. In a way, Rowley turned decline into identity, and survival into performance art. And there is a lesson in that which goes well beyond one prairie town. Not every plan works out the way we expect. Not every place we invest in, move to, or build our life around will become what we imagined. But Rowley reminds us that reinvention is a resource too. Sometimes the most valuable thing left after a collapse is not the original business model, but the creativity to use what remains in a new way. In retirement, in real estate, and in life, resilience is not always about rebuilding exactly what was lost. Sometimes it is about seeing new value in the pieces that are still standing. 7. Grosse-Île, Quebec, the Island of Tears. After the humor and reinvention of Rowley, we arrive at a place with a very different emotional weight. Grosse-Île is not a traditional ghost town at all. It is a ghost island, and its silence carries the kind of history that stays with you long after you leave. Located in the St. Lawrence River downstream from Quebec City, Grosse Ile was established in 1832 as a quarantine station for immigrants arriving in Canada. For more than a century, over 4 million people passed through this island, each one carrying hope, fear, and the dream of a better life. In that sense, Grosse Ile was once a gateway to the future. But in 1847, it became the scene of one of the darkest humanitarian tragedies in Canadian history. That was the year the Irish potato famine drove desperate families onto overcrowded ships bound for North America. Many of those vessels became known as coffin ships for good reason. Disease spread rapidly. Hunger and exhaustion had already weakened the passengers before they ever reached shore. When ship after ship arrived at Grosse Ile carrying refugees sick with typhus, the quarantine station was overwhelmed beyond capacity. At one point, dozens of ships were waiting offshore with thousands of ill passengers on board. There were not enough beds, not enough doctors, not enough supplies, and not enough time. In 1847 alone, more than 5,000 people were buried on that small island. Families were separated. Children were orphaned. Many who had crossed an ocean in search of survival never made it any farther than this lonely point in the river. Later, during the Second World War, the island took on yet another grim role when it was used in secret bacteriological research. So Grosse Ile carries layers of history, immigration, suffering, public health, and war, all pressed into one place. Today it stands as a National Historic Site, marked by a solemn Celtic cross overlooking the water, honoring the memory of those who died there. And for anyone who loves travel, not just for scenery, but for meaning, Grosse Ile is a powerful reminder that many of the freedoms and comforts we take for granted were built on sacrifices we may never fully understand. It teaches gratitude, it teaches humility, and above all, it reminds us that resilience is often born in the harshest conditions imaginable. From this island of sorrow and remembrance, we turn now to a place where isolation created a different kind of identity, one shaped not by famine or disease, but by rain, industry, and the strange ability of a remote community to keep reinventing itself. 8. Ocean Falls, British Columbia, the Rain People. If Grosse Ile is defined by grief, Ocean Falls is defined by endurance. This is one of those places where the environment is not just a backdrop, it is the main character. Tucked into the coast of British Columbia and accessible only by boat or float plane, Ocean Falls sits in one of the wettest regions in North America. The rain here is not occasional. It is constant, defining, and relentless. Locals earned the nickname the Rain People because living here meant learning not to resist the weather, but to build a life inside it. That very rainfall is what made the town possible in the first place. In the early 1900s, entrepreneurs realized that the enormous volume of falling water could generate hydroelectric power, and that power could support a pulp and paper mill producing exceptionally white paper. So despite the remoteness, a major industrial town was built. At its peak around 1950, Ocean Falls had a population of about 3,500 people. It had schools, a hospital, and even one of the largest hotels in the province. It was isolated, yes, but it was also a tightly connected community, one of those places where the people who lived there had to depend on one another. But like so many towns on this list, Ocean Falls was tied too closely to a single economic engine. When the mill closed in the 1970s, the population collapsed. What makes this story especially striking is the irony that followed. The same rain that had helped power the town and make its industry possible now became one of the forces destroying what was left behind. Roofs caved in, wood rotted, buildings decayed quickly under the pressure of the climate that had once sustained them. And yet Ocean Falls did not become a simple story of abandonment. The dam still generates electricity, and in a modern twist few people would have predicted, some of that excess power has been used for Bitcoin mining. It is such an unexpected pivot that it almost sounds fictional, but it captures something important about the life cycle of places. A town may lose its original purpose, but that does not always mean it has lost all value. Sometimes the future arrives in a form nobody would have imagined during the town's first chapter. For viewers thinking about retirement, relocation, or how communities survive change, Ocean Falls offers a smart lesson in adaptation. A place does not remain viable by clinging to its old identity forever. It survives by finding new uses for its existing strengths. Industries change, technology changes. Even the harshest environments can become assets in a new era if people are willing to think differently. And Ocean Falls proves that sometimes the key to survival is not escaping the rain, but learning how to channel it. 9. The Newfoundland Outports, the forced exodus. By this point in our journey, we have seen towns undone by collapsing industries, unstable ground, and changing technology. But the Newfoundland Outports tell a different kind of story, one that feels in some ways even more unsettling. Because sometimes a town does not die from nature or economics alone. Sometimes it disappears because a government decides it no longer makes practical sense for people to remain there. Places like Great Paradise and Ireland's Eye were not temporary settlements. They were deeply rooted coastal communities shaped by the sea, by family ties, and by generations of shared hardship and survival. Great Paradise, for example, had existed since 1758. These were places where people did not simply live, they belonged. The isolation was real, of course, but so was the sense of identity that came with it. Then, between 1954 and 1975, the Newfoundland government launched a resettlement program aimed at moving people out of small, scattered outports and into larger communities where services could be delivered more efficiently. On paper, the idea may have looked logical. Lower costs, easier infrastructure, better access to schools, roads, and healthcare. But for the people living there, this was not just administrative policy. It was the dismantling of home. And the process itself was painful. In many cases, communities needed an overwhelming majority to vote in favor of relocation before families could receive even a modest payout to move. That meant neighbor could be turned against neighbor, not because they hated each other, but because they feared losing everything if the vote failed. Once the residents were gone, some of these communities were even removed from official maps, as if erasing the name could erase the memory. One of the most unforgettable images from this chapter of Canadian history comes from Ireland's Eye, where families were so determined not to lose everything that they physically moved their houses across the water. Entire homes were lifted, set onto flotation drums, and towed by boat to new locations. It is an extraordinary image, part heartbreak, part resilience, and entirely human. Even when forced to leave, people still tried to carry a piece of their world with them. For anyone thinking about retirement, relocation, or what truly makes a place worth living in, the Newfoundland Outports raise an important question. How do we measure value? Governments may calculate based on roads, utilities, and efficiency. But people measure life differently. They measure it in community, memory, belonging, and the comfort of knowing where they fit. And that is why this story stays with you. It reminds us that convenience is not always the same as quality of life. Sometimes the things that make a place inconvenient on paper are the very things that make it meaningful in the heart. And with that, we arrive at our final stop, a place so visually severe, so environmentally scarred, that it feels less like a ghost town and more like a warning left behind in concrete and ash. 10. Anyoks, British Columbia, the apocalyptic boom. For our final town, we travel back to British Columbia, to one of the most dramatic and unsettling places on this entire list, Anyoks. If some ghost towns feel quiet, nostalgic, or mysterious, Anyoks feels industrial, scorched, and almost post-apocalyptic. Even in ruin, it still looks like a place that pushed too hard, took too much, and paid the price for it. Anyoks was built in 1912 by the Granby Consolidated Mining Company as a major copper smelting town. And this was no small outpost. At its peak, It was home to nearly 3,000 people and stood as one of the most powerful industrial operations in the region. Over 25 years, it produced hundreds of millions of pounds of copper. To support that output, the company built what was, at the time, the tallest hydroelectric dam in Canada. In pure economic terms, Antioch was a machine of extraordinary efficiency and ambition. But the wealth created there came with an environmental cost that was almost unimaginable. The smelting process released constant sulfurous fumes, poisoning the surrounding landscape so badly that nearby hillsides were stripped bare. Trees died, soil was damaged. The terrain turned harsh and lifeless. Workers were known as gas eaters, a nickname that says a great deal about daily conditions. And perhaps the most shocking detail of all is that the contamination was reportedly so severe that children could set the snow on fire. That image alone tells you that this was not simply a successful industrial town. It was a place consuming its own future in real time. Then came the Great Depression. Copper prices collapsed, the operation shut down in 1935, and the town was abandoned. But even after the people left, the damage remained. With vegetation gone and the land already weakened, massive forest fires swept through in the early 1940s, destroying nearly all of the wooden structures that had survived the shutdown. What remains today are the giant concrete ruins of the power plant and other industrial structures, surrounded by black slag and stripped terrain. It is remote, difficult to access, and haunting in a way few places are. Antioch is a fitting final stop because it brings the central lesson of this entire journey into sharp focus. Wealth without sustainability is fragile. Growth without balance is dangerous. Whether we are talking about mining, real estate, retirement planning, or our own health, the principle is the same. If we keep extracting without replenishing, eventually there is nothing left but damage. Antioch stands as a monument not just to human ambition, but to what happens when ambition outruns wisdom. And in that sense, it is more than a ghost town. It is a cautionary ending to a story about everything we build, and everything we risk losing when we forget that permanence is always an illusion. What we leave behind. And when you step back and look at all 10 of these places together, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Every ghost town on this list was once somebody's whole world. These were not just dots on a map. They were communities filled with routine, memory, and meaning. They had main streets and school days, grocery runs and weekend gatherings, first loves, family dinners, and neighbors who knew each other by name. What makes these stories so powerful is not only that these towns disappeared, but how quickly so many of them did. A price collapse, a failed shipment, unstable ground, government policy, environmental damage. Again and again, we see the same lesson from different angles. No matter how permanent something looks, nature, economics, and time can change the picture far faster than most people expect. But there is another side to this story, and it may be the most important one. The ruins are only half the legacy. The other half is the resilience of the people who lived through these changes. They carried their homes across the water in Newfoundland. They reinvented a fading prairie town in Alberta. They rebuilt their lives when mines closed, mills failed, and entire communities vanished. That is what stays with me most. Not just what was lost, but how people kept moving forward. And maybe that is the real reason places like these matter so much, especially for those of us thinking carefully about where and how we want to live. They remind us to ask better questions. Are we building on something solid? Are we too dependent on one idea of security? Are we appreciating the season we are in before it changes? And when our own chapter is done, what will we have left behind? Property, profits, memories, wisdom, community, or something deeper? If you enjoyed this journey through Canada's forgotten places, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Retire and Roam, and share it with someone who loves history, travel, and the deeper stories hidden inside real places. And down in the comments, tell me this. Which of these ghost towns would you most want to explore for yourself? Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and never stop roaming.